afternoon. Hey, everybody. Jim LaPierre from SoberNow.com coming at you on a number of streams this afternoon through our friends at ChooseHealth.com, through SoberNow.com, and a number of Facebook pages. If you haven't already liked SoberNow's Facebook page, please do. A lot of cool articles posted there. And talking with you today about overcoming codependency and having healthier relationships through the course of our recovery. The term itself, codependent, is really so overused at this point that it's like the term dysfunctional. We use it to refer to millions of different things. So to me, codependency is... my worth depends on your approval, my worth depends on your acceptance or your feelings about me. And obviously, we talk a great deal about codependency in the context of recovery. We talk a lot about the desire to be independent. And too often when folks tell me how independent they want to be, what I hear is, I'm really afraid of relying on other people. We all, of course, profess to have trust issues, and that's true. And for the most part, what we learned about relationships, parenting, partnering, relationships with our siblings and extended families, all of that is from our family of origin, and that's the foundation that we're working from. And unfortunately, an awful lot of us are working from really unhealthy foundations. And through the course of recovery, whether that's from trauma, mental illness, addiction, or all three, we're trying to learn, okay, how do I do this in a healthy way? And I'll give you the short answer to that I think is the most important piece. The foundation for the relationships in my life are based on two foundational relationships. The relationship I have with myself and the relationship that I have with a higher power. So every other relationship is based on that. I have a long history of being my own worst enemy. I have a long history of being avoidant of myself, and everything about that compromised my ability to give and receive love in a healthy way. For me, I think the biggest challenge in my codependency was being a one-way street. So I would give and give and give. I would sacrifice, and those things came very naturally to me. They were a product of learned behavior. But to ask for what I needed felt impossible. To reach out and develop new friendships or healthy relationships felt impossible. And in general, really, in retrospect, seeing very clearly that not knowing my own value and not having a clear sense of identity made me very susceptible to other people's opinions. Having established a healthy identity, having gone through a lot of healing myself, I have a strong sense of who I am today. And so how other people perceive me is still important to me, but it's not like it used to be. I often hear from people in recovery, I just want to get to a place where I don't think about I don't care what people think. And honestly, I don't think anybody ever gets there. I think what people think about me, I like to be liked. I like to be respected. I like it when people think well of me. But it doesn't rock my world if somebody doesn't. It's just their opinion, their perception. And I think a huge piece to overcoming codependency was that I came to view how they treated me not as a reflection of my worth, but as a reflection of their character. And I think that's a vitally important piece. Codependency, of course, runs in families in much the same way that anxiety runs in families. We've been able to establish that anxiety does not have a genetic link. It is a product of learned behavior. And lots of different folks from every different background and walk of life, have codependent tendencies. And what I noticed over the years of serving folks in various forms of recovery is that there's a lot of overlap. So if you are in addiction recovery, sure, there's an excellent chance that you have some codependency on board. But it's also the case if you've never experienced addiction, but perhaps you're an adult child of an alcoholic. We're going to talk a lot about that today because the work of Gladys Black and other researchers have really demonstrated what we call the laundry list, common characteristics and roles of people who grew up in families where addiction was present. I've also found that essentially the same behaviors and false beliefs were instilled in those of us who didn't grow up in families where addiction was present but abuse or neglect was. And so a huge part of our recovery is unlearning things that were instilled. And I recognize how hard that is for folks because the earliest lessons of life are deeply ingrained. But what I've shared with folks over the years is whatever was instilled can still be extracted. It can be brought out, examined, and then we can choose. Is this how I wish to live? Very much welcome your questions and comments. Please throw anything at me that you'd like to. If you're on Sober Now's Facebook page or my personal Facebook page, Jim LaPierre, feel free to fire some questions or some comments and some experiences that you'd like to share. Real brief, the history of this. Codependent is actually, for an awful lot of years, was a legal term, meaning that any stipulation or agreement depended upon something else. The kind of understanding that we have today of codependency started in the 1950s. It actually was born out of the addiction field. As early as the 1950s, folks who were working with alcoholics in recovery, of course we always want to bring family into treatment, and what we started noticing was what we refer to as a co-alcoholic or a para-alcoholic, which was typically an enabling partner, significant other, or other family members. Research into codependency exploded in the 1980s. It led to kind of the book on codependency is Melody Beattie's Codependent No More. It took a couple of important turns when we started looking at things like love addiction. In the late 80s, we had a couple of big contributors. A psychiatrist by last name was Cermak suggested that codependence is a disease, noting that it has a very addictive process, that we sometimes become addicted to people. And my experience is that if we say that we're addicted to someone, that is most often a romantic relationship. It is most often what people refer to as mommy and daddy issues. And I've always hated those terms. It's a very cheap way of referring to something that is very precious and important, which is typically unmet developmental needs from our family of origin. Children who are too young to truly understand what self-esteem is nonetheless have it. And so the lessons instilled from our family of origin and the needs that were not met by our family of origin oftentimes becomes things that we seek subconsciously in all of our relationships, but most prominently in romantic partnerships, and interestingly in the relationships that we have with authority figures, particularly in our occupations. Psychiatrist Charles Whitfield, towards the end of the 80s, described codependence as a chronic and progressive condition of lost selfhood. And I completely resonate with that. I know that having a strong sense of personal identity and a strong degree of self-acceptance are really those are the two most vital keys to overcoming codependency. And I like talking with folks about a term that I rarely hear, which is the idea of interdependency. Interdependency is the idea that two people who are relatively independent can come to rely on each other in very healthy ways and relate in very healthy ways. I know that that's true. I learned virtually all of those lessons in the hardest way possible. I've been married for 32 years, and the reason I've been happily married for 32 years is because my wife did not kill me early on in our marriage. I was extraordinarily codependent, and I was intensely and acutely aware of her needs and wants and feelings, and I would frequently act on those before she had even had a chance to ask or indicate or maybe even know that that's where she was at. And when it came to my own needs, I would either deny them or I would hint at things that I wanted or things that were important to me, and she would say very reasonable things like, you know, you can just ask me. And I reacted to that at the time like it was the craziest thing I ever heard. It went against everything that I had learned in my family of origin. So I'm going to run down for you real quick the laundry list that comes from Adult Children of Alcoholics and the writing that's been done there. If you're not familiar with it, definitely check out adultchildren.org. It's a fantastic resource. For everybody that I've ever given reading material to on Adult Children of Alcoholics, I think they were really astonished to realize that so much of what we struggle with is actually extremely common, and it's a direct result of growing up the way we did. So the laundry list, quick and dirty. 14 traits of adult children of alcoholics. We became isolated and afraid of people and authority figures. We became approval seekers and lost our identity in the process, or perhaps never had it at all. We are frightened by angry people and any personal criticism. We either become alcoholics, marry them, or both. Or perhaps we develop a compulsive personality, such as a workaholic or a caregiver, and essentially we fulfill other people's needs and not our own. We live life from the viewpoint of victims, and we are attracted by that weakness in our love and friendship relationships. We have an overdeveloped sense of responsibility, and it is easier for us to be concerned with others rather than ourselves. This enables us not to look too closely at our own faults. I found that's especially true with people that work in the healing and helping professions. For people like me, the most honorable way to avoid ourselves is in constant service of others. In our personal lives, that tends to take the form of caregiving, where we're, again, hyper-focused on the needs, wants, and feelings of others and avoidant of ourselves. Continuing down the list, we get guilty feelings when we stand up for ourselves. We confuse love and pity and tend to love people we can pity and rescue. We have stuffed our feelings from our traumatic childhoods and have lost the ability to feel or express our feelings because it hurts too much, and living in various forms of denial. We judge ourselves harshly and have a very low sense of self-esteem. We are dependent personalities who are terrified of abandonment and will do anything to hold on to a relationship in order to not experience painful abandonment feelings, which we receive from living with sick people who were never there emotionally for us. Alcoholism is a family disease, and we became para-alcoholic and took on the characteristics of that disease, even though we may not have ever picked up a drink. And finally, para-alcoholics are reactors and not actors. This is the concept of being reactionary and not responding. What I find is that for most of us, our words and our actions are oftentimes the equivalent of emotional reflexes. It's like you go to see the doctor and she hits your knee, your leg flies up. We have a certain feeling, or we feel pressured or compelled to act, and so that reaction is typically not consciously chosen, not thought out. It's just an emotional reflex, and it's something that we have an enormous amount of experience doing. It's something that we don't really think about at all. So again, the consummate book on recovery from codependency is by Melody Beattie. Can't recommend it highly enough. It's a classic text. It's been popular for over 30 years. And I'm going to share with you just a few of her thoughts, and then we'll kind of open it up to questions and suggestions. Melody asserts that codependents are reactionaries that tend to either overreact or underreact. Underreacting would be like shutting down, checking out, just kind of freezing. But rarely do we act. We react to the problems, pains, lives, and behaviors of others. We react to their problems, not our own. Melody asserts that being able to work with feelings about rejection. We are people who are hyper aware of feeling rejected, which is a trigger for feeling abandoned, and oftentimes it's not that the people who abandoned us necessarily left and never came back. It's that they were emotionally unavailable. They were simply people who failed to meet our needs. And again, we don't need to condemn them or be concerned about blaming them, but what is vital is that we acknowledge the needs that went unmet, that we consider how that's limiting our lives today, how that continues to hurt us, and that we move to correct that. Melody Beattie makes the point that we should never take rejection as a reflection of our self-worth. That's absolutely true. For most of us, struggling with feelings of shame, struggling with guilt over things that were a part of our past, continue to limit what's possible for us in the present. I'm going to pause now and see what we have for questions. My friend Aislinn has a question about how do you end a relationship when you have a history of abandonment issues. I think the most basic and simple strategies are what we need here. Really being present in the here and now is a physical process and an emotional process and a spiritual process. So when we're triggered or anxious or fearful, oftentimes our breathing is shallow, our heart rate's accelerated, our body is tense, and it makes everything that we're trying to manage in the present all the more difficult. And so I always encourage folks to start with self-control, get your breathing under control, release physical tension, use sensory input that helps you to connect fully to the here and now. Because otherwise, the pitfall is when I feel now the way I felt then, I might act now the way I acted then. And that's problematic because the way that I acted then was, again, reaction instead of response. It was based on emotion and not something that I thought through all that well. And it almost always was something that felt like a compulsion. It felt that this needed to be done immediately. This needed to be done to the point that it was resolved, and no matter what it was that I needed to sacrifice, that had to be done. So when we talk about abandonment issues, that past loss is most often a wound and an emptiness that yearns to be filled. I think it makes us overly sensitive to the needs and feelings of others. I think it prevents us from having a strong awareness of self, and we become locked in a pattern of the fear of hurting others, the fear of disappointing others. And what I've learned about that is that it forms unrealistic expectations for me of myself. So when I am very concerned about I'm going to disappoint them, I'm going to hurt them, what I'm really doing is taking responsibility for their emotional well-being, which is never my responsibility with adults. With my children, when they were growing up, yes, I had a lot of responsibility to their emotional well-being. But other than that, the only person whose emotional well-being I'm responsible for is myself. And that too was a hard-earned lesson. It culminated in the second year of my marriage in a terrible fight in which my poor wife screamed at me, "You are not solely responsible for my happiness." And I was bewildered. I said, "Well, of course I am. I'm your husband." She had this crazy idea that she was responsible for her own happiness and that I could add to that, but that it ultimately was not my responsibility, which is not only true, it's self-evident. It's just not what I grew up believing. It's not what I grew up experiencing. And so it is not what I brought to my marriage initially. Occasionally I've been asked when I do couples work, are you the man that your wife married? And I'll say, oh dear God, no, thank God I'm not. That was a long time ago. There's been a lot of growth ever since. And the real key to our marriage has been that we've grown together. We've gone through good and bad as each other's best friend. And I think this is the most common mistake that couples make, is that we talk about growing apart, which I think is crap. I think ideally, the way that a partnership works is that I have a life and she has a life and we have a life together. And what I know is that when one of these isn't working, then this one doesn't work. So really having a great deal of vulnerability, which of course is the key ingredient to intimacy, goes against everything that I learned as a codependent, but it simplifies everything. It prevents misunderstanding and unnecessary conflict. And it's as simple as being willing to say, here's how I'm feeling, here's what I want, and here's what I need. I'm convinced that probably 90% of all misunderstandings and conflicts would disappear if we could do that with each other. But I get it. It's scary. It's hard to do. There's a formula that I've heard from folks in recovery. It's called When You, I Feel, and I Wish. So instead of pointing the finger and saying, you always, you never, here are the faults, and I've taken your inventory, and here are all the things that you should change, what we're identifying instead is, here's how I'm being affected, here's how I'm feeling, and here is either a solution or a destination that I'd like us to get to. I think it's pretty rare that couples talk about the process of their relationship or how they're communicating. 9 times out of 10 when couples come to see me, they're asked, what is it that you need to address, or what is your goal of going into treatment? And the answer is almost always, we have communication issues. And the reason they have communication issues is most often because they've been steadily pulling back and not getting enough support from themselves individually. I think the key to a good marriage is that both partners, or a good partnership, is that both partners have a really strong support system and are not relying exclusively upon one another. I think kind of the height of codependency is the romantic notion that we still see in romantic comedies, which is that the right partner can meet every need you would ever have, which is insane. I think meeting every need I have would be like 4 full-time jobs. So just gonna take a quick look for questions, comments, things that we want to talk about. Let's see. Oh, thank you, Katie. How can you heal the mother wound of yourself without contacting or having the mother in your life? I think that's a vitally important piece. Quite often when we think about how am I going to resolve an issue, we think about the person that we're in conflict with, and quite often they're not healthy enough, they're not safe to have in our lives, and so we need to be able to get those needs met and resolve those conflicts without them. So this is a huge piece of why I'm so big on chosen family. When my children were growing up, I had taught them the expression that you can never have too many moms or too many dads. And so a lot of the families that they grew up with were not biologically related, but we were people who chose each other. And so it really does take a tribe. It really does take a lot of loving people to raise healthy children. So to heal that mother wound is to address some of the most primal aspects of self, because there is nothing more basic to life than this is my mother. That is the most foundational piece. And so whatever needs have not been met there, we need to look first and foremost at what we internalize, because quite often we treat ourselves the way that those who hurt us the most did. We internalized especially painful things that they would say to us, or forms of abuse that were bestowed upon us. For a lot of us, the real issue was neglect, and so that leads to a child growing up believing that her thoughts and feelings and needs don't matter. And quite often we live by those rules. There's an expression that my friends in Al-Anon use and other forms of recovery, which is what we lived with, we learned, and what we learned, we became. And there's a great deal of truth in that, and I like the simplicity of that approach. I think the challenge for so many of us is very simple. I think it's hard for us to receive love. And I think there's a progression there that can be incremental in nature. Even accepting a compliment is a big step towards receiving love. Being able to accept recognition, validation, affirmation. The real tragedy for so many of us as codependents is that we kill ourselves to earn love, acceptance, and good things, and then we are too uncomfortable to receive them, so we push them away. Even something as simple as being recognized by our employer for doing an especially good job becomes something that is too painful to take in, and we we'll water it down, we'll minimize it, we'll deflect it, we'll do all of these things, which really is cheating ourselves out of what we've earned. And what it took me a long time to learn was, first of all, that I was doing that I was cheating myself out of all this good stuff. But then secondly, the reason I was pushing it away was because it was uncomfortable, and unwittingly what I was doing was absolving myself of the responsibility of change. So healing and growing always take place outside of my current comfort zone. So when I'm deflecting praise, or when I'm invalidating the person who's trying to build me up or empower me, what I'm really doing is insisting on maintaining status quo. I am not willing to change. I'm not willing to consider the possibility that they're right. And so that means that I get to stay the same. And I don't want to stay the same. I want to be able to continue to grow and heal. So that means that not only do I have to let other people have their truth and their opinions, I have to let them be nice to me. I have to let them meet my needs. And progressively, I need to ask for those to be met. So I'm just going to check through real quick, see if we got any other thoughts. Please, by all means, check out the work that we're doing at SoberNow.com. There's a program there for affected others. I've always hated that term, but clinically we refer to those of us who have a loved one in active addiction as affected others. And there's an enormous amount of codependency that tends to be part and parcel to that experience, the tendency to sacrifice, to enable, to deny our own needs, to put our lives on hold. All of those are very common. If you have a loved one in active addiction, my heart goes out to you. I know that pain well. I also know that too often it becomes a barrier to taking care of ourselves. It becomes a barrier to even maintaining relationships with our non-addicted friends and family members. And so SoberNow.com has a 28-day program for affected others. It's completely confidential, completely based in anonymity. We literally don't even need to know your name for you to access the program. And we have a program for those who are maybe contemplating making some changes around their use of drugs and alcohol and looking for a little bit of guidance for getting through the first few weeks sober. So that program is available at a low cost as well. I want to give you the resource of choosehelp.com. There's a ton of good articles on there, and what I love about writing for choosehelp.com is they're very, very pragmatic. So they don't just get caught up in analysis or feelings. They're looking at, okay, let's get down to how do you actually do this. I have a series of articles on that site about how to rebuild relationships, how to end relationships, and how to preserve yourself in a relationship with someone who's in active addiction, and hoping that those would be helpful to folks. Wonderful question from Helen Clemmy. Thank you. How do we overcome those feelings of guilt and shame? I think it's necessary that we expose them. What I mean by that is bring them out into the open, whether that means putting them on paper or speaking them to a therapist, a coach, somebody who is objective and can give us some guidance. Because what we often find is that, first of all, the things that we most feel ashamed of are not things that we've done. They were things that were done to us. And so I would challenge you to consider, if this was somebody else's life, would you say that they should be ashamed of themselves, of that past experience? And most often we see things very differently if it's someone that we care about. If it's just ourselves, we have a tendency to be highly critical, to devalue ourselves, to be unkind and unfair in our judgment. When it comes to guilt, I'm always, well, first of all, small distinction between shame and guilt. I love this expression. Guilt is I did bad, and shame is I am bad. And I have met some bad people, but those are people who are not looking to change, are not looking to transform or better their lives. The people that I've met in every single form of recovery were absolutely good people, and we don't judge them by their past. We judge them by who they are today and who they're trying to become. I always want to encourage folks to look closely at guilt. Quite often, guilt is something that we experience even when we've done nothing wrong. So rational guilt is your conscience saying to you, we've done something wrong, we need to fix it. Irrational guilt is, I've done nothing wrong, but it feels like I have. My friend Artis used to have this expression. She called it something, excuse me, she would call it, something's wrong, it must be me. So when we feel like outcomes are disappointing, things aren't working out the way they should, we immediately feel bad about ourselves. Oftentimes we feel personally responsible. And so guilt for us is kind of this default setting that it's our go-to. Because guilt is familiar and it's more comfortable than being angry or expressing and identifying the ways in which we've been hurt. So I think that's a really super important distinction. Let's see, other questions? How can codependency be dealt with? I think, again, examining the ways in which we relate to ourselves and the ways in which we are connected spiritually, whether that's to nature, to a higher power, to something more powerful than self, are the real keys to that. I always encourage folks to monitor their self-talk and to notice we're talking to ourselves all day, every day. We're just doing it mostly on a subconscious level. I always encourage journaling. So journaling to me is a way of getting on the same page with myself, quite literally. All of those thoughts, I don't judge them at all. I just allow them to come out on paper. And then what I notice is, okay, what are the ways in which I'm being terminally unique? What are the ways in which I am judging myself in a way that is fundamentally different than how I judge others? Are there ways in which I'm being self-limiting or self-defeating? Because as I eliminate those and as I allow people to help me change those processes, I have more harmony and more peace and a healthier way of being, which leads to healthier and more harmonious relationships with others. Thank you for the kind words, Lisa. I appreciate that very much, and it was actually you who brought us this topic to start, so I thank you for that. I'm going to be winding up in just a moment here. My plan for Sober Now is to join you every Thursday at noon Eastern Time. I welcome topics that you'd like to see discussed or questions that you'd like to have answered. Jim@sobernow.com is the easiest way to connect with me. I would love it if you could put a like on this video and maybe share with friends and family, because they're always wanting to reach folks that are, whether they're struggling in active addiction, struggling at some phase of recovery, or struggling because they have a loved one in active addiction. I think all of us clearly are affected by addiction, and all of us ideally want better for ourselves, for our friends and family, and I think connecting this way is just one more way to do that. Please check out our YouTube station. We have about 70 or so videos there now, covering a host of different topics in addiction recovery and recovery from trauma, and that is expanding all the time. Please subscribe to that station. You'll get notified every time we post a vlog, which is on average once or twice a week. Would love to connect with you, Jim LaPierre on Facebook. Feel free to add me, or just shoot me an email. Let me know what's going on in your recovery. I'm gonna leave you and ask that you take excellent care of yourselves until we talk again. In the midst of everything that's happening in the world today, our self-care is more important than it's ever been. So I thank you. I look forward to connecting more with you. And again, take excellent care of you. Thank you.